Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. We have two main items of business tonight, looking at the Council's tree management strategy and Section 106. So a little bit of variety, but we'll dive straight into the main agenda. We have apologies from Councillor Whitcroft, who is substituted by Councillor Joe Coles. Welcome, Councillor Coles. I believe Councillor Lavassi is on his way, and I think that's it. Any declarations of interest from any colleagues? Silence is golden. Righto. Minutes from the previous meeting. I believe we've had some sort of minorish amendments suggested by Councillor Stewart just before the meeting regarding spelling. Is that fair to say? Okay.
Well, not spelling,
Sorry.
proofreading, just like it says a part rather than a part, for example, and things like that. It's
Okay.
you know, those sorts of things. It talks about Bishopthorpe rather than Bishopthorpe Road for Gwen's comments, etc.
Got you. And you've captured.
Yeah, we have a.
Sorry.
Yeah, Councillor Stewart's provided me with a copy of that.
Smashing, thanks. And I've had a heads up from the exec member, Councillor Jenny Kent. There's no mention of her being present in the last meeting, even though she very much was present. So we'll work them in. But I'm not seeing any other hands from colleagues. Pardon me, which takes me to public participation. We just have one speaker tonight, I believe. That's right, isn't it? And that's Gwen Swinburne. Gwen, well versed in this arena. Whenever you're ready, have your 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I have circulated a paper outlining governance proposals for the community infrastructure levy in the deprived inner wards, which lack parish councils. Parish wards are entitled to 15% CIL share or 25% with a neighbourhood plan. We get nothing directly. To ensure fairness and ahead of the 15-year overdue community governance review, we really must establish a transparent, member-led governance system to deliver funding to the inner wards. In the absence of any council proposals, my paper gives practical approaches from other councils to achieve this. May I suggest you ask the Audit and Governance Committee to oversee the development of a robust member-led framework to manage and monitor CIL funds effectively, ensuring fairness and accountability across all wards and parishes. Chair, the statutorily required annual infrastructure statement provides valuable transparency on infrastructure funding. To maintain oversight, I request that the Economic Scrutiny Committee review this statement annually upon publication to ensure fairness. Re the current Section 106 balances that I sent to you, we estimate roughly 6 million. It could be 4, it could be 2, it could be 8 of these are historic balances, some stagnant for over a decade. These appear now owed to developers and should consequently be treated as contingent liabilities with accrued interest in the accounts. Despite repeated objections raised during annual accounts inspections, these frozen funds are a growing liability. Please also ask the A&G committee to investigate this particular pool of funds, clarifying obligations and propose solutions to resolve this long-standing issue promptly. Finally, the Groves area, marked by significant deprivation, faces unique parking challenges. Hundreds of metered parking spaces, a large res park zone with increasing numbers of parking spaces being sold to guest houses and HMOs, disadvantaging residents. Unlike other areas, the Groves bears a disproportionate burden of metered parking. May I propose that the committee include the Groves parking inequalities in its forward plan?
30 seconds.
Thank you. Addressing metered space proliferation, res park boundaries and opaque parking allocations to restore fairness. That's it, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen. You say that's it, you packed a lot in there.
I try my best. Mr. Grock helps.
But very much appreciate your contributions, and they will be taken into account, and I will try to action the points you've asked me to action. Thanks for your
And
contributions.
thank you, Chair.
Cheers. Okay, colleagues, that brings us to the tree management strategy paper, or tree management and strategy. I don't know if that's an error or if that's the way it's meant to be written. Can I invite the involved officers and exec member to the front? Thank you. Unless someone's sitting on someone's lap, yeah, pull a chair over there. Imagine that. Sat on someone's on. Okay. Right, so I think you're all well versed in how we do this. We will treat the paper as read, but if any of you want to give a brief overview before we get into questions, that'd be appreciated.
Thank you, Chair. So as you know, you've requested we address some key points in this, and perhaps I'll just summarise the questions you asked and where I think we're at. So you've asked about the challenges in terms of this. So we have the ambition for more tree planting, and that's laid out in various documents that the council, from its 10-year strategy through climate change and things like that. But the challenges we face are often around land availability, so identifying places to plant more trees. Highways are obviously often seen as an easy place to target tree planting, but actually they're full of utilities, and whilst it looks green, is actually really complicated to do, and often actually some of the most legislated space to try and plant trees. So in terms of the compliance with the Highways Act, etc. There's a relatively short planting window for planting trees, which creates its own challenges when we're trying to do this at scale. And I think the other thing I would say is that the changing climate means that planting trees and establishing trees is becoming more challenging, as is the species that we select. So whilst part of the process might be to try and target native trees, actually climate change might mean that we need to start thinking about planting different trees as we go forward to ease that establishment process. Just the final point is that stakeholders aren't always that supportive of tree planting when it's close to their homes. Everyone wants more trees, but not necessarily if it's too close to their homes. Paras 16 and 39 set out the details around the changes in legislation, and I think some of that goes back to the experience Sheffield had of trying to remove significant numbers of trees as a sort of policy decision. Doesn't really apply in York here because as per our borough cultural policy, we only remove trees if they're dead, dying or dangerous, and that policy's on our website. You asked us about the number of trees planted versus the number removed. In recent years, we've far exceeded the number of trees planted compared to lost. But I think in part that's been to the success of Sean and his team in terms of attracting external funding so that we can plant more trees. So we have done particularly well with that. I think what I would flag is that as we plant more trees, tree maintenance will become more of a challenge. So in terms of, as I said, watering and establishing them becomes a challenge, but also that ongoing maintenance, inspecting them every 4 years, any maintenance required. So as that number increases, that burden will increase for the council. And the final question you asked is about the work we do with private landowners. So as the report sets out, we work quite closely with White Rose Forest and St Nick's, and we have the tree wardens who we work closely with as well. And obviously from a planning perspective, we deal with trees on private land, both in terms of permissions and in terms of removals and in terms of neighbour disputes, which obviously part of it as well. So I'm obviously joined by Ian as the head of service here, but we've also got officers in the background if there are any questions which stretch my knowledge or expertise beyond my ability.
Thanks, James. Much appreciated. Do any members want to kick us off? Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. Just a quick question around ongoing maintenance, particularly when new trees are planted. Obviously, we've benefited from some grant funding that's allowed more urban trees to be planted. Can I just check whether part of the package was the sort of watering on a frequent basis, and which is fine, but what else can we do to encourage residents to sort of adopt the tree that has appeared in front of their house, who might be happy to do, but I know some residents are concerned they don't want to overwater it and then kill it. So it would be, and I know some maps were published showing the locations of the Green Streets trees. So I just wondered what, an assurance that there is ongoing support for those trees in terms of watering, and what else we could legitimately do to encourage residents nearby to play their part in helping them not die.
Yeah, so we can certainly, where we plant new trees with, so where there's a maintenance period, that will include watering. So most of the trees we plant will come with a maintenance period and a watering regime for them. That probably varies from location to location about the arrangements. So some arrangements will have it, some might be us doing it, some might be the contractor doing it. So they will vary. There is probably more we can do about encouraging and advising residents about watering if they're willing to do that. I'm not aware that we issue any guidance on it. I'm looking at officers, so we can certainly look at that if it's a concern that residents don't know what to do in terms of watering.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So in the recent Green Streets planting, I think particularly on Millennium Fields, various residents did come out in this recent hot weather and water anyway. And I think, I mean, I'm looking to our tree experts, but I don't think in the period of sort of 2 months of rain, we got lack of rain, you could kill a tree by giving it more water. It would, I think that's not, I mean, now we're going to get floods and I'll be proved wrong, but that's, yeah, so I wouldn't worry. And I think part of the work we want to do in terms of encouraging refreshing the neighbourhood volunteers, whether they're leaf sweepers or snow wardens or tree wardens, is looking at that and getting more encouragement or more uptake for people who would be willing to look after a tree. And I know when our tree expert plants trees, if there are people roundabout who are interested in helping, I mean, an example I'd give is at the end of St Albans Place, where 2 cherry trees were put in this season, and they replaced beds which kept drying out, and the group of residents we spoke to were looking after them this season, watering them. So more of that kind of activity is definitely planned.
Thank you. Councillor Coles and then Councillor Merrill.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of questions. One was just whether the benefits, or whether you could say a little bit more about the benefits in the inner wards versus the outer wards in terms of the impact on air quality of tree planting. That would be really helpful. And then another question that I've had, particularly in my ward, where we've got part of the ward that has a particularly high water table, where actually we do get localised flooding, or quite regular, even in this kind of dry weather, some quite wet ground. Whether or not actually having additional tree planting in some parts of the city where there might be a high water table might help with some of that localised flooding, obviously notwithstanding wider flooding issues in the city, but for that localised flooding that you do get in certain parts of the city. Just anything you can add that's not already in the report to that.
So trees definitely have a beneficial effect to air quality. I think that's well proven. It probably is in a sort of, in a former life, in a former council, we actually did some pilots of this in London, in very urban areas, about what different trees do to air quality. And it is quite a micro change. So it tends to be in a relatively small area that the benefit is felt. Obviously, any air quality improvement is a wider benefit, but the tree will have a relatively localized benefit. The challenge, therefore, is that air quality tends to be worse in the most urban areas where tree planting is the hardest. So getting those two together is really challenging, and that is without doubt part of the challenge. But there are wider benefits beyond just air quality. There's the cooling effects trees have in terms of heat. There are a whole raft of benefits of trees through that, as well as the sort of mental health and well-being effects of trees. So there are a broad range of benefits to trees, and air quality is undoubtedly one of them. The water table point, so trees will potentially help that in terms of water uptake. They do take up vast amounts of water. What we would need to look at, though, is that sort of principle of right tree, right place. So recognising there's a high water table, we would need to pick tree species carefully, that they were happy in that environment. So it would be about picking the right tree for the right place, but definitely possible.
Councillor Kemp?
Thank you. Just to add to that, other officers have heard me give this statistic, but it's one I really like. And in terms of not just air quality, but urban cooling and urban shade. So Medellin, which was previously only ever known for, or Sean actually will correct me, I can't pronounce it properly, Medellin, but was previously known for drug running and cartels, managed to lower their summertime temperatures by 4.5 degrees just by planting trees in their streets and removing bits of highway and having gardens running through it, mainly volunteer maintained as well. And that's without any extra additional energy costs through air conditioning, and 4.5 degrees is huge. So there are benefits, but again, this is in built up areas, so there is going to have to be a trade-off in changing climates to being what we use our streets for. Pocket parks are really popular. I know it's an ambition of many around here to increase the numbers of those in our urban areas, but that comes at, there are competitions for street space in terms of car parking and other items as well, but also biodiversity, being able to hop or fly or jump from, species connected corridors. It's really important to have connectivity. And on the localised flooding and surface water issues, I know Councillor Cole's raised certain areas where you've got a long slope or a gentle slope in your ward, and everyone's removed their hedges and paved over their drives and the water pools at the bottom. Everyone is probably an exaggeration, but areas like that, if anyone has suggested sites, our trees, Mr. Lawson can look at that and see whether it's suitable, what tree would be suitable, whether it would help. And so identifying that before the next tree planting season would be really helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt?
Yes, thank officers for the report. Representing one of the city centre wards, which has probably got some of the least tree cover. The few that have been done are welcome, but having spoken to or contacted Sean this morning, most of the sites that were identified in our ward weren't progressed because they run foul of the rules or they were more expensive to do. So I do think there need to be some tweaks to the policy. Otherwise, we end up with leafier suburbs and continued desertification in the more densely built up parts of the city. And one of the things I was wondering about, I can't find the paragraph at the moment, but the report referred to, I think it was using a 3 metre distance for new trees and a 10 metre distance for existing trees. And yet when you read the 35, the NJ guidance, it basically says there's not really a problem with utilities, even at 600 mil. So that does strike me as unless officers can give some other reasons, an excessively onerous test, which particularly mitigates against providing trees in the central wards. And so that's one of the issues I hope that we can perhaps get some changes on. But the adopt a tree type approach, I think, is certainly quite important. I know in the group of streets where I happen to live, residents have volunteered to help water some of the recently planted trees nearby. So I think there's quite a lot of will to do that out there if we work out how to actually engage people and make it more widely known. So I agree with Councillor Fenton on that particular issue. Thank you.
Please spread that away and look at the detail in concrete and the guidance.
Thank you. I'm next on my list, if I may. Couple of questions. So in section 12 of the paper, it says on average, public realm plant between 25 to 40 new trees per year. Obviously, that's not including all the other work that goes on with third parties and the trees that we can plant through one-off funds that we've received. I'm just curious, if we take away the third party contributions and what we can do with one-off pots of money, how does that average of 25 to 40 new trees per year sit with how many trees we're losing on average?
Pardon? I think the it's probably about even, I would say, from memory. So we only move trees if they're dead, dying or dangerous at the moment. So those are the only trees we remove. It's really hard to give an accurate figure on that because sometimes we lose trees through a natural process and we never find out.
Yeah.
So it might not be until we go out to inspect 4 years later and we go, this tree's no longer here, that we find out the tree's gone. So attributing it to a particular year sometimes is really difficult. So I don't think we're in a position to give a really detailed answer in terms of being absolutely certain about how many trees. The vast majority of our maintenance work is maintenance, not removing trees. As I say, we only remove them if they're dead, dying or dangerous, basically,
Okay.
which is what the policy position is.
And the reason I asked the question is more from a sort of lingering anxiety that I have, which might be completely unfounded, in that because of funding limitations and the various restrictions that exist with planting trees in urban residential areas, I sort of worry that if you fast forward 50 years, you'll have a situation where your urban residential areas have very few trees or fewer trees at an increasing rate. And the trees that we are able to plant are in sort of clusters where it's easy. Is that a fair sort of worry to have? Because that would worry me because
I think this comes back to the point that Councillor Merritt was making. It is a real challenge for us in terms of those, the challenges that I opened with are absolutely greatest the closer to the city centre you are. That's just the reality of working in an urban environment. At the moment, we have been opportunistic, given all those challenges, and that's not to say it's easy further away from the city centre. There are still challenges around it. We've been opportunistic so far about where can we plant trees, and given the significant amounts of money we've had to plant trees through the funding streams we've attracted, we have been opportunistic about that and planted them where we can. So I think your challenge is probably fair to say, actually, in the longer term, we need to think harder about how we plant trees in the more urban environment, particularly if we are losing trees in that more urban environment.
Yeah. Thanks, James. And I'll ask one last question and then I'll let colleagues take over. That should be me done, all being well. It's about the maintenance and the pressures on the team that currently exist. Are you Harvey, by the way? You are the Harvey Lowson. Great. Okay. So in your opening summary, you said that as a result of the extra trees we are planting, it will mean it becomes even more challenging to maintain the trees that we do have. As soon as you said that, I thought, well, going off what I'm aware, it's already a massive challenge. Because, and I say this with absolute respect and understanding, the amount of times we pass on resident concerns and are told no because the relative thresholds for action are very high because there's not that many people to do the work. I'm just sort of trying to get a sense as to how that team manage, how they feel. Obviously, I can't remember the exact fund, but we planted a load of trees and there's funding that covers some of the maintenance future on that. But those trees will still need maintaining in 10 years' time, 15 years' time when that funding isn't there. So at some point, does the current team say, we can no longer do this without another 1 or 2 staff members? Or does that threshold for action just continue to get ridiculously high? You see where I'm coming from?
Yes, and I think as trees in different environments have different maintenance requirements. So our tolerance of a tree in a park or in a woodland is, in terms of its condition, will vary to that is on the side of a highway being passed by thousands of people a day. So that risk approach you take, and this comes back to the point about the urban centre as well being more challenging, is different, because you will be more risk averse for a tree in an urban environment next to the highway than you might be in a rural environment, in a park, for instance, or in a woodland. So the maintenance requirements differ, or the risk profile differs. At some point, it's a political choice at the end of the day what we spend our money on. At some point you may reach a point where the council goes, actually, we need to invest in this more. The challenge is around that it's not as simple as going, actually, do you know what, we want to add one more person, or they tend to operate for safety reasons as a team with a couple of people climbing and one on the ground, for instance.
Sure.
So it's about, actually, when do you reach that tipping point to go, we now need a team of 3 in a vehicle, and that's quite a significant investment. So it's trying to get that balance right. The tree policy we've applied and the rules we apply about when we will and won't intervene haven't changed since the arboricultural policy was approved here in 2016, I think. So that policy position actually has been the same since 2016. We haven't tightened it anymore since that point, from memory.
And very briefly, to your awareness, or indeed, I'm happy for Harvey to contribute as well if he wants. Are we near that tipping point currently? Interested to know what
they haven't got spare capacity. Let's put it like that. So there's a backlog of work. I think that's absolutely fair to say. And at the moment, we struggle. If one of them is off sick, then that impacts on our ability to do work. So yes, we probably are, is the reality.
All right, cool. Thank you. I've got sorry, Councillor Kent, then I'll bring the supplementaries in.
Sorry, just in relation to your question about the sort of, and Councillor Merritt's increasing desertification of the inner city wards. I mean, that's partly my point about saying we need to think about how we prioritise use of our streets and our generally how we look at how we live. But just at paragraph 24, in the most recent Green Streets planting, it shows there that 80% of it, almost 80% of it, was planted in areas of high or moderate need in terms of the tree equity score with the Woodland Trust tool, which the tree planting team use. So it's not just that we're taking the low-hanging fruit. I think the low-hanging fruit is probably gone pretty much now in tree planting, and none of it's easy, as James said, but we actively, where we can, or the officers actively direct them to places in need and low or high need, moderate need. And the second point I was going to say about the tree teams, we've had this conversation because the number of residents, we probably all have this, who have complaints about trees growing too big, too tall, too near their house. We can't prune them as much as residents might like, but I think I'll be corrected by the experts in the room. But I think also the sorts of trees we're planting now, the right tree, right place includes planting trees which may not grow to the same heights as the older trees in our city for similar reasons. That it means longer term maintenance is going to be less. And the initial contract, so for the Green Streets planting, the initial contract is to get them to maturity, or the first 3 years of watering and maintenance. For the next 10, 15 years, all being well, they shouldn't need touching. Is that fair? And then after that, they're not going to grow to the same significant heights as other trees that have been planted historically in the city, which may lessen the maintenance. But that doesn't mean that if you had all the money in the world, you wouldn't want a second tree team right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I've got supplementary from Councillor Coles. Is yours a supplementary, Councillor Stewart? Cool.
Thanks. Just a supplementary really about the maintenance point, but also just whether or not Public Realm have discussions with the adult social care team about older residents who might consider removing trees from their garden because they can't maintain them, and particularly in certain parts of the city where actually that tree cover is probably really important, and where there is a risk that you lose more tree cover from private gardens because people can't maintain the trees themselves. And certainly just referring back to the point I made earlier about the whole water table point. Exactly in that water table is a very large tree in a private garden that we were told could not be maintained by the council. And the risk is that that tree, the person who lives in that property then decides to remove that tree and will make the water table problem even worse than it already is. So I suppose it's just whether or not we're joining up some of those conversations with other parts of the council in terms of ensuring that older residents don't feel kind of intimidated by their tree so much that they decide to remove it because they can't get it maintained, and actually then we lose that from the city. Anyway, just another thought.
I'm not aware we are having those conversations directly with people on private properties and whether they're at risk. What we do have though is the tree protection process, so you can put a tree protection order, is that right, TPO, on a tree if we think it's at risk on private property. So there are processes we can go through to protect trees on private property from being removed if they are, and there's a threshold to what we can apply them to, but there is a process to protect trees if we think they're at risk.
Councillor Stewart.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I was thinking very similar to you that we've allowed Harvey out of his box where he normally sits there sending members very, very knowledgeable, very helpful emails, but which end with, unfortunately, there aren't the funds available, so nothing can be done. So it's great to see Harvey, and I thought he might have made it to the dizzy heights of this table, you know, maybe.
Welcome.
Is that something we could maybe think about? But no, I think on the resourcing issue, I think it's a real point. I think a lot of the sort of jobs that we seek to be done, not putting the resources in at the outset, you know, does just literally create a more expensive, more costly, more time-consuming thing, whether it be something like a tree falls down or something like that. So, but my simple question was going to be: is this something where, given what James said about, you know, it needs a group of 3 people or what have you, that we can look at doing more? I'm assuming we don't do it with North Yorkshire and East Riding, for example. You know, if they're potentially in a similar situation of needing a team of 3 people, not quite having it, you know, it would strike me there'll be times when we need that help and times when they need that help. And particularly given that you'd have something like a flood or a storm that may not affect everybody equally. So is it something that could benefit from being looked at as more of a shared service, so we can combine the expertise and potentially get more?
Potentially. The challenge I would suggest is that when the demand is greatest is just after a storm, and they tend to hit us all at the same time. So yes, potentially that is something that could be looked at about the shared service model. But yeah, I think bearing in mind that we'll all be fighting over the same resource at the same time in a sort of storm or wind type situation.
Interesting. Thank you. I've got Councillor Anne Hook next. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm very concerned that the inner city's losing trees and needs trees very much. And it's wonder when you hear a blackbird chirping in the inner city, you think, gosh, there must be some trees somewhere for him to live. But the leafy suburbs aren't necessarily as leafy as they used to be. Back in the days when Councillor Stewart was heavily involved with Poppleton Life, he was on a tree planting committee. And as far as I know, not one tree has been procured by that committee to be planted, which is an absolute tragedy in all that time. And even now, there's been recently some utility. Yorkshire Water was digging a big sewage containment pit, and that involved cutting down a lot of trees. And they want desperately to plant some more trees because they've been told they've got to plant new trees, but they're not getting. And we thought, oh, good, well, if parish council can't work with the council to get more trees, perhaps an authority like Yorkshire Water might be able to, but they're having problems as well, finding the trees, the places to plant the trees. So you would, hopefully their clout and presumably their money, because they seem to have a lot to give to their shareholders, they can give some of them to us to plant trees, which would be great. And the other thing that really concerns me is the centres of villages are conservation areas, and one of the joys of conservation areas is trees automatically have the equivalent of a TPO, which means you shouldn't be able to cut them down. But recently, planning has been coming back saying, well, we don't know why you put in a planning application to cut down that tree, because you can't see it from the road. So you can do it anyway. And when the developer cut downs that damaged someone's tree, so it had to be removed in a neighbouring garden. They was told, well, it can't be seen from the road, therefore there's no issue. And we're getting that from planning now, which is really, really concerning, because whether a tree can be seen or not, it's a tree and we've got to keep them. So that's a big concern. So all is not well in the leafy suburbs, unfortunately. And there's lots of places where we lost trees down roads and we understand about utilities, especially now you've got the cabling extra stuff. But yeah.
I mean, I feel your sort of frustration, but I don't think there was a question.
Well,
So-
it's can someone look into this planning rule? Why is it
Okay,
changed?
all right.
That's one of them. And also, can you work with the authorities other statutory authorities that need to do it and try and take their money and
So-
their
We do work with
trees?
other statutory bodies. So we work with Environment Agency on tree planting, for instance, and we've helped them plant trees. I think if you send us the details of a specific planning case and send those to Becky Eads, she can pick those up and look at those from a planning perspective and respond back to you about what the policy position is or isn't, and what council officers can or can't do within that policy position, which I suspect is the issue at hand.
Thank you, James. Councillor Merritt, was that a supplementary when you had your hand up before? or-
It was really to reinforce what Councillor Hook said about the Environment Agency, because there's an Environment Agency development in our patch. They need to replace 5 trees that are getting lost. So I asked them where they were intending to plant the new ones, and I got told Hemsley area. Which is a bit disturbing. So yes, I think we do need to work better with agencies like them to get the trees where they're really needed.
Thank you. And I see that Harvey Lowson has joined the table. Did you have a particular contribution to make, or is it just to be there if needed from now on?
Well, both, but the tree preservation, I was just going to come back on the tree preservation order rules. Those rules are set by central government, and the rule is that if the tree is not visible, then they are allowed to take them down. That's a national guideline, part of the tree preservation order rules. So Matt Stubbins, the tree TPO officer, he would advise you on that. But I think it's something like 3 points around the tree. If you can't see the tree from 3 different points, then it wouldn't be protected or wouldn't be worthy of protection. It's just the central government rules.
Can we lobby the government?
Yeah, it sounds like we should really. Okay, well, thanks for that, Harvey. Next, I have Councillor Healy. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Chair. Many moons ago, we had a scrutiny committee that had the park person who managed the parks. And one of the comments he made is what a lot of park managers would do to improve their park would be plant a tree. Now, what I wanted to bring up is when you're planting these trees, have you got any feedback from the local councillors or local knowledge? It's just that on Bailey Hill near Skeldergate Bridge, you planted a tree literally in the middle of a patch of open grass. So where the community used to use that for kicking around a football and a picnic, they're not going to be able to do that anymore. So there are some circumstances where planting a tree just isn't appropriate. And if I could request on behalf of a resident and not a local councillor, that someone looks at that tree and possibly removes it and puts it somewhere else, that would be most appreciated. Because at the moment, they're all in a line.
This could be an email, couldn't it, Councillor
Could be,
Healy? Sorry.
The question is, when you have planted these trees, particularly in the urban areas, have you discussed them prior to planting them with local councillors? There you go, Chair.
I'm trying to avoid a cast of thousands.
Okay, yeah.
So it was water by a resident.
Yeah, I don't know that specific tree and if it is a council planted tree or a Green Streets planted tree, but in the Green Streets programme, wherever we planted a tree, we have notified residents that live in the immediate vicinity of where we've been planting those trees to submit feedback, comments, suggestions to where we plant trees. I will check if that was one of ours and if we got any responses when we did that, but I'm not certain. But we would typically do that as part of the Green Streets programme.
Yeah, if you can come back to me, that
Yeah.
would be useful.
Thank you. I've got a supplementary from councillor Burton, Ben Burton, sorry. I panicked then.
Yeah, just on a similar, I mean, as the consultation period process got a lot better as it went on, which is really good in terms of where those trees are, but flagging it in terms of Melrose Gate Field, for example, by planting trees, I think one of the issues that the council is going to face is that most of our land is in urban areas, is in city centre locations, but we have a commitment to plant huge amount of trees, which is only really viable by using rural locations to do that significant amount of trees realistically. So I guess it's to follow on is to avoid running that risk, because we're basically going to be running out of rural land, the big fields that we used to have. Are we looking to partner with private landowners or other people to look at how we can extend tree planting without having to maximise spaces that are also used for playing football and other things? Because that's the risk that we have, isn't it?
Yeah, two parts to that question. Just probably to contribute to the conversation about urban versus rural tree planting and why, at least during the Green Streets programme, we've tried to plant in the urban centre but struggled. The funders, one of the core metrics provided by the funders is acreage of trees planted, and they don't differentiate between whether that acreage is achieved in an urban or rural environment. And they also fund the planting of trees at a fixed rate for each tree, and they don't distinguish between the higher cost of planting in an urban environment between the rural environment. And so we've been dictated by the funders to try and provide more numbers, which forces us down the path of rural tree planting and adds to the challenges of urban tree planting. The other side of the question is how we work with other landowners. As part of our involvement in the White Rose Forest Partnership, we've set up a White Rose Forest District Group, which meets with other partners across the city to encourage them to plant trees and help them access funding to plant more trees on their land as well. So we are trying to encourage and increase those partnerships, acknowledging that we're not going to achieve the planting numbers that we want by ourselves.
Thank you. I've got councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I was just thinking about sort of the funding and how we've had some funding, but we don't have a specific tree planting budget other than the general public realm. I know that some wards try and set aside some ward funding if there is available to support tree planting and other initiatives that residents are supportive of. Is there scope for some more coordination? For example, if Harvey, if you're placing an order for some trees in September for planting between November and February, a sort of date by which if ward teams want to do some planting, get your orders in, and then you have a better idea of what you think people might be after. Because I know in some areas, and this is where it blatantly does favour some better off areas in terms of some of the residents on our street. So of course we're happy to contribute, and it's great that some residents are in a position to do that. But not every street in the city is able to do that. But where we do have residents who are motivated and able to financially contribute, then we can sort of put that money into the pot as well to maximise the planting that we can do. So it's just a question as to whether we could pursue something like that to give you a bit more certainty around, if you are placing an order, then you know what you're working with.
Well, that just means it's basically sorry, by the end of summer, ideally, I would say probably August time is the sort of cut-off time to when I'm really need to know what I'm doing the following winter. So if you've got sites you want to look at and assess, I can do that. And I think in most cases we do, where people have offered to plant trees, it gets done, generally speaking. And if there's ward funding, certainly then it becomes a lot easier to do it.
Harvey, just supplementary to that, I mean, could you, would you be able to send all councillors a very short email just saying that? Because I reckon a lot of people from different wards who aren't on this committee might fancy putting in. And if they missed the boat, they missed the boat.
Yeah, I mean, the standard price would be about £300 per tree planted under the system I use.
Yeah.
So if you've got ward funding, then yes, we can put trees in. That again, subject to underground services and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, we covered a lot of ground in about 40 or so minutes there, colleagues. Unless there's any burning questions, I'm sort of curious as to whether anyone has any recommendations in mind. Councillor Merritt.
I'm happy to take up Mr Gilchrist's suggestion of reviewing their policy in terms of the distances to utilities against the NJUG much smaller distances. I think that would be one recommendation we would ask to take place.
So that's, sorry, that's reviewing the
reviewing he said the current policy is, as I say, it was somewhere in the paper, 3 meter, if there's utilities within 3 meters of a potential location for a new tree or 10 meters of an existing tree, then you won't put a new tree. But the NJUG refers to much lower distance tolerance against utilities. So I would have thought if that's reviewed and hopefully more generous distance is allowed, we might be able to get more trees in the more built up area parts of the city.
Thank you.
Clearly there's still the financial challenge. So, you know, whether there's any avenues out of Section 106 payments for open space. I don't know whether trees in open space might qualify.
We can possibly get into that in the next item.
Yeah, and ward funds, because otherwise we're not going to get any change in the relatively sparsely treed parts of the city.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm comfortable enough with that, but Sean, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, the 10-meter recommendation, it's not policy, it is a recommendation from the utility companies themselves that no trees planted within 10 meters of their assets. Which, if we stuck to that policy, would clearly mean we barely have space in the entire city to plant a tree. So we haven't followed that. We have softened to the NJUG guidance, and in some cases acknowledged that is only guidance and planted even within 6 meters, which was NJUG. And as a local authority, we've had to take a view on the risks associated with doing that. We think we've taken a measured approach to risks. We've done that on a case-by-case basis, and we've been comfortable with the tree planting approach that we took. But yeah, clearly, if we abided by what the utilities companies would want, we would barely be able to plant a tree in the whole of the city centre.
Thanks, that's helpful. The only other thing, well, one other thing I wanted to, sorry, Robert, go on.
Could I just check then, after Sean's given that clarification, is that still a recommendation to review?
Well, it sounds to me like as a council, we're already happy to push against that guidance or those recommendations. So I think Sean's contribution has possibly satisfied that, unless you see otherwise, Councillor Merritt.
No, I think it may have done. I think that then perhaps confirms that the key issue is the cost of digging up more hard areas. Is that the issue for places like Guildhall and Micklegate and Aldgate?
Yes, it's one of the challenges, all of the challenges that James gave at the outset, and we've got to balance all of those challenges against each other.
Okay. So we need to see how we can try and engineer a more flexible financial regime to allow desertified areas to benefit from the policy.
I mean, I would happily support that recommendation too, but it sounds that's probably more tricky by the sounds of it. And the only thing I was going to add was the specific point around, I forget the detail, but this government policy, and if you can't see a tree from the road or 3 particular points, I mean, I think it'd be good for the committee to recommend that the executive member writes to the relevant government department to ask them to review this. We're getting nods and thumbs up. So I'll see that as accepted. Councillor Hook.
The other one is that when utilities or some other organisation has an obligation to plant trees, we try and get them into somewhere in York rather than Helmsley, if possible.
Yeah,
because
so
use that extra funding because they're obliged to do it in order to get around the tricky bits. It's more expensive because I'm quite happy for Poppleton trees to go into the centre of York.
Sure.
Happy, but
yeah, so better working with utilities and partners to help them achieve their tree replanting obligations or replacement. Okay, I mean, I'm comfortable with leaving that there. It sounds like a tricky line of work. We've obviously got Harvey's commitment as well to remind all ward councillors that they can buy in with his collective order if they get in touch with him in the right timescales. Is that to come in or to say it's to come in? I thought you might have been saying bye, Councillor Kent. Sorry.
Well, both. I only thank you for your indulgence. I just wondered if it would be all right for me to express thanks to all the volunteers across the city who've done an awful lot of tree planting, both in conjunction with Green Streets and ourselves, but in particular at Tremendous, which was formed many years ago. And Barry and Derek have stood down this year after, they're both of advanced age, but they've between them probably managed the planting of, I don't know, something over 10,000 trees, something like that, which certainly including that. And huge thanks to them and all that they've done over the years. And Tremendous has now been taken over by St Nick's, but I just want to express gratitude on behalf of the city to them and to all volunteers who help us.
Yeah, I think that's a very good shout. Thank you, Councillor Kent. Their contributions to the planet are probably far greater than many of ours, planting so many trees. Councillor Stewart.
So just wondering, when Harvey's sending out his email to all members, is it worth adding 2 other things which are potentially reminding members about how you can get a TPO put on a tree that's in private land? So I think a lot of TPOs are viewed as they're there rather than as proactively sort of thinking, actually that tree could do with one. And secondly, is it worth issuing a clarification on how people could help if they wanted to about potentially watering trees, because again, my view would be that that's not really known, by people in terms of where they get involved, who they'd speak to, and CYC. I guess if we're looking to plant a tree in an area, we could knock on a few doors, leave a few houses, but just a bit more clarification on that and how ward councillors can help might be useful to tag on the email.
I think it would be useful. I mean, Harvey, what?
Well, there's 2 different aspects there. The main issue is that TPOs are dealt with through planning, and it's a planning process. So I don't deal with TPOs myself. So Matthew Stubbins is the man to ask for advice on TPOs. But the legislation is in a blue book that you can download off the government website. So all the legislation is there for anyone to read. And I think on our website it actually explains when you can TPO a tree and when you can't TPO a tree and so on. So that's all set in stone, and we just work to those rules. So that's the TPO aspect. What was the other aspect? The watering. We always encourage people to water trees, always. And if the problem is that if you plant a tree outside a house and they don't want the tree, they won't water it. But you do get people who actually request trees, and they will always water them. And you can't really drown a tree, so you can water it as much as you want, which I think came up earlier. So we always encourage that, because obviously we can't afford to water it as much as we'd like to do. But the council planted trees generally do very well. We have 95-98% success rate. So very few of them die.
Thank you, Harvey. I think it still might help to remind members of those points, but I'm not going to get into the territory of advising you how to write an email. I think we're beyond that, really. So look, very much appreciate the discussion there and the questions and comments from members and the answers received. It's clearly something everyone cares about, but it's one of those things that's a bit more fiddly than the lay member of the public might initially realise, but it is of quite critical importance. So we'll move on to the next item. James, you're staying for this, aren't you? Are you here for 106? Yeah. Councillor Merritt. Yeah, we can have a 5-minute refreshment break. Okay, so welcome back to tonight's Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. The next item of business is looking at section 106. which is a major sort of mechanism through the planning system, quite technical, a lot of it fairly regimented, but as ever, we'll take the paper as read and welcome a briefing, not a briefing, a summary from the officer who is James presenting on this tonight, and the executive member, Councillor Pavlovic. Nice to have you here. I should say, for a little bit of context, I believe the initial ask for this first come from one or two committee members sort of asking the question around member input into 106 early on. And I know this is not straightforward and there's not too much input that members can have. But I think, Councillor Stewart, it may have been you, and it was something that I've experienced where we've seen 106 agreements published and you're a bit like, that money could have been better spent in this other green space or that other sports club or something along those lines. Is that fair? So would welcome a lot of the discussion to focus around that, given that that's where it's come from. But as ever, welcome all questions from members. But James, Councillor Pavlovic, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. So apologies, as you know, Chair, Becky Eads, who really knows this subject a lot better than I do, can't be here tonight as the head of service. She's got a personal appointment she needs to be at, but she does send her apologies. I guess there will be technical questions which I cannot answer, and Robert will make sure he captures those and feeds those back to Becky so that we can come back to you as a committee with any questions that I'm not able to answer. What the report sets out is the process of entering into Section 106 agreements, which are legal agreements between the council and developers, which the council is held to account often by developers to make sure it delivers. The planning department play a role in orchestrating that because it is through the planning process that these are secured. But then the spend of those is usually with the delivery department. So using the examples you just used of a sports club, it'd be the sports development team that would lead on that, not planning in terms of spending the money in the same way it would be public realm who deal with a parks one, or a transport would be the transport team. So to a certain extent, planning get us to the point of securing the money, and then other departments lead on the delivery of those projects. And as ever, it's about priorities in terms of delivery. We've worked through an example in the paper to give you some context of how an obligation would work and how it's secured and how it's tracked. We have, based on previous discussions at Scrutiny Committee, invested in the monitoring system, which has significantly improved our ability to keep track of and monitor those Section 106 agreements. And we've tightened up the process, and that's recently been audited and been through to A&G Committee, the Veritao audit. So the only other thing I was just going to add is that the comment from the public speaker about parish councils, I will get Becky to clarify this, but looking at the government website, my reading of this is that basically you get 25% to a parish council if you have a neighbourhood plan. If you don't have a neighbourhood plan, the parish council get 15%. If there is no parish council but a neighbourhood plan, 25% is earmarked for that community, and the local authority consults with that community about how the funds can be used. If there isn't a neighbourhood plan, it's 15%, and the local authority consults with the community to agree how best to spend that neighbourhood plan because there isn't a parish council to do. So the money allocated to the community is the same. It's just that the local authority acts as the parish council. What I'll do is I'll send Robert the link to the government website so that it can be included in the papers.
Yeah, thank you, James. I mean, that neighbourhood plan requirement feels almost arbitrary. But you know, that's what it is. Sorry, go on.
Thank you, Michael. The one thing I would clarify is that a community could go, we haven't got a neighbourhood plan, we'll take our 15% and develop a neighbourhood plan, which then gets us 25% next time. So there is an option to use the section 106 to develop the neighbourhood plan, if I read it.
Yeah, I like the creative way you've looked at that. Yes, Councillor Pavlo, did you have a hand? Forgive me.
So, the arbitrariness, sorry, I'm sure that's not an actual word, of a neighbourhood plan, is these are incredibly complex pieces of work that take many years, from conception, if you like, through to implementation. And they are community led, and we only have 6 of them in the city. And I think we have something like 57 parish councils. So how many parish councils do we have?
I mean, this can be.
Anyway, there's a lot of parish. Whether there's 57, there are 6. There are 6 neighbourhood plans. So it is a complex piece of work, but the fact that even where they are at that level, if they don't have a neighbourhood plan, those percentages are 15%, capped at £100 per dwelling. So there is it's not an open-ended section. It's not an open-ended commitment.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Pavlovic. We'll go to questions. I think Councillor Merritt was first, if not the only one up. Fire away, Councillor Merritt.
Yes, just one thing about the audit report. An audit report was done last year, but the Audit and Governance Committee were still concerned that that report had not examined the issue about the timeliness of spending the Section 106 monies that had been received. And the Audit Committee agreed that should be further examined as part of this year's internal audit programme. So it's not a finished story at this point, and I think that is one of the big issues. And the registered speaker spoke on flagged that issue as well. I think one of the key issues here is now we've got this Execom system, but the internal audit flagged some issues in terms of who was able to access it in order to actually maximise its benefit, and hopefully that's being addressed at the moment. But I think the other issue is, whilst we see an annual report of where things are overall, I think one of the big benefits would be if we can have more detail available, both as councillors, but I think frankly also for the public, in terms of how the actual spending of the money is being progressed. That would be really helpful as a ward councillor, but it's also questions that get asked by residents. We know that monies were given as part of that development, but the things that were promised haven't happened. I think if it was actually, if the information could be actually put on the council's webpage website in an appropriate form, that would actually be much more transparent and would increase the accountability of the council for delivering the requirements of that development. If we're getting this money for things that should be benefiting occupants, then it's important that those improvements are delivered, and they are also delivered in reasonable time, which is, I think, one of the big issues that we've had with the current arrangements. So I'd certainly very strongly like to see further improvements to the system that would help deliver that transparency and accountability.
Thank you, councillor Merritt. I mean, at risk of sounding a little bit flippant, that to me sounds like a no-brainer. So why isn't it more transparent?
Well,
Or why can't it be if it can't be?
I would reference you to the infrastructure funding statement we publish each year, which gives the details of the section 106 as a starting. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we do publish each year the infrastructure funding statement on the website with all the applications, the amount of money that's been secured that year, what its intended use is. So we do that each year as part of and we have to do that legally. So we do that each year now. So what we probably don't do is give as much detail as we could on the progress against each of those. And that might be something that we could look at going forward.
Yeah, thank you, James. Supplementary from councillor Healy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Mayor picked up one of the points that I was going to bring up, so I'll just bring it up as a supplemental here. I did have a look at some of these planning infrastructure statements. It's very difficult to track a payment, money's in against money's out, because in essence, what you have to do is open a PDF, copy the planning application number, search for it in that document, go to the next year, search for it in that document, so on and so forth. And you typically get, I don't know, 20, 30 payments, but no, planning applications that cover various different items in a year. So from a member / public way of monitoring that spend, it's very, very difficult. It would have taken me a long time. So a suggestion I would make is, in addition to that 1 year view, you have a 5-year view, and it's more sort of like a spreadsheet.
The challenge, of course, is that it is very complicated, and making it simple isn't easy. So what the infrastructure funding statement does is set out the funding secured that year. What you've got to understand then is whether triggers are hit or not. Just because it's in there means we've entered into the agreement that year. A trigger may not be hit for 5 years. We may see no money in our account for 5 years till the trigger's hit. So understanding spend against it would become a beast of a document to do that, because it records when you enter into those agreements. Then you need to understand when the triggers are hit. You then need to understand the delivery mechanisms for that. So it does become quite complicated. So trying to produce something that is both accessible and that complicated, we need to look at whether there is something separate for members we can go away and look at and see if that would help.
Can I come back?
Sure.
Yep. You've got that in your one document, or in your documents. You're just not taking the spend information and then adding it back to the income. So I'd suggest it's not that complicated.
Well, it doesn't include whether the triggers have been hit. So the
document includes the spend.
The infrastructure.
Yes, it does. If you look at the document, it includes that.
I was looking at it until it's just closed down, literally.
Drop further down the document, and it will have money's in and money's out.
As I say, it's just died.
Councillor Pavan, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, it's the complexities and if you like, some of the opaqueness. And this is an issue that I've been grappling with long before I became executive member. When I was chairing audit and governance, it was questions that we were asking is about how do we account for the money. The new Execom system that was a recommendation actually from this committee in 2020, I think it was the opportunity to then record everything. But even within that, as it's highlighted in the report, you can have one condition that has multiple triggers with multiple payments that are accruable at multiple different times in the lifetime of a development. So you can have a payment that's due when the first 50th house, when the 50th house is occupied, when the 150th house is occupied, and then again when the 500th house is occupied. Now, it's incredibly hard in recording when that payment's come in and what it's been allocated to. You can do it, but it's going to involve whoever it is that's looking at that spreadsheet, working their way through it. And the thing about, we could have spent that money on this sports club instead of that sports club. Well, that's one of the difficulties that the planners have. It's not for the planner, it's not for the planning department to say, oh, I actually prefer this club to that club. We'll allocate the money to that. That's where the consultees come in, and that's where they go to the departments and say, what is the need in this area to mitigate this development? And that's where they have the expertise of. Now, where I think you've got a really strong argument is to say, actually, in my ward, we feel there's not enough X. It could be bowls, it could be whatever. And we would like, when Section 106 does become eligible, that the sports and recreations officer thinks about, this might be what we need. And I think that might be a way in which members can more accurately reflect what their public are asking for. So it's a piece of work that we have to do with education, but mainly I think from ward councillors' perspectives, you're talking about parks and open spaces, you're talking about green infrastructure, and you're talking about sports equipment. Those are the three big areas I think that you'd really like to have more of an input in, and that's something I think that depending on what your recommendations are areas that we can spend more time looking at.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovic. I think I've got a supplementary from Councillor Stewart.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's a sort of similar point to, well, the point you made about the point that I was sort of making before I'd made it, about the point that Councillor Pavlovic has made, if that makes sense. In that, I do absolutely think it's vital that members have a say in Section 106. Now, I am not for 1 second saying that members have power or decision-making voice or anything like that, but have something, are consulted. I think that'd be a really, really important way to take things forward. I think, and Councillor Pavlovic, and the way he's articulated some of the examples, I think shows exactly what we need. And an example in Cottonthorpe, and I could talk for such a long time, but I won't, about so many issues. Well, I was going to say I would like to take you out for a coffee or a Diet Coke to discuss some of these things more, maybe. So that that'll hopefully be an offer I can put. But in Cottonthorpe, for the Tadcaster Road development, the Section 106 has £320,000 going to Askham Bog, okay, for 140 houses. Now, there is no way whatsoever any sane person can claim the damage to the bog by those houses is going to be over £2,000 per house. It's absolutely ridiculous. And that's borne out by the fact the Simborg Lane development, as proposed, which was rejected at planning committee, and is probably about 30 seconds further in Tadcaster Road, had a Askham Bog mitigation of £0, 0p. And those sorts of examples do just make a mockery of the system. I asked why was and also it was for the car parking in the main, that was a large part of it. Well, there are no people less likely to use a car to get to the Askham Bog than the people in Tadcaster. So it was just basically Yorkshire Wildlife Trust finding there was some money available. They've got a bog, understandably, they're worried about development and a fiddling of the figures, a rigging of it. So they got some money, so they weren't unhappy. I, as group leader, I, as ward member, asked various questions about it. The parish council asked, we put in FOIs, which became EIRs. They were refused. About 7 months after first asking why we had allocated 300,000+ pounds to Aston Bog from that one development, I started to finally get some emails which basically say exactly what I've said about there is money available. And that is just totally wrong.
Fiddling and rigging.
Well, they didn't use words like fiddling and rigging. No, that's my interpretation. But in Cottonthorpe, we've got a right of way called Yorkfield Lane, okay, which basically links up the development with the centre of the village. And that in the S106 has 120,000 pounds allocated to it. And that is a make or break, make this a place where people are either going to not particularly want to walk down, not particularly cycle down it, or make it so everybody's going to be using it as a sustainable way to get to the centre of the village. And that would have been the thing that everybody in the village would have wanted to see the S106 go on. And I think that's the sort of thing where we can have that conversation. Another example would be, we've got sports funding, which is basically about being for sports facilities in the area. Now in Cottonthorpe, there is a world of difference between something that is in the Rec, for example, compared to Bishopthorpe, the next door village. So all those things, I emphasize, it's not a decision making, it's not anything like that, but to have that, I think that'll be a really positive thing. And I've spoken to the developer, on the site, and he said, well, of course, as ward member, you will have been involved in this process. And I said, no, it doesn't work like that in York, So I think that'd be a really good recommendation to have. So that was just my point to really agree with that.
I mean, if I may, it feels like to me that the key is getting into the relevant officers and getting on the same page as them, or getting them on the same page as the ward councillors before it hits that planning discussion. Sorry, James, you want
Well, I was just going to echo that. It's not just how it doesn't work in York, it doesn't work nationally, because that's what the legislation says. What I would say is that there is nothing to stop members working with officers that represent parks and open spaces and discussing what the strategic intents are for your ward. So actually the point is to get in before it's part of the planning process to identify the priorities for your wards in terms of future section 106 allocations. So actually the strategic intent for what an officer may request for transport impacts in your ward or for education. So actually those discussions are with the experts who are then consulted as part of the through the planning process. So I think it's about being in front of the planning process almost, because that is a prescribed process.
Thank you, James. I will come to you, Councillor Vassy. Is that a supplementary? No, I'm guessing. Or because I've got Councillor Pavlovic waiting too.
We've been hearing it's too complicated. We're hearing everything's too complicated. And my take on that is simply, if it's too complicated to write down what it's for, what's agreed, and how it's to be spent, how can anyone have confidence that it's going to be spent in the way that anyone might want? No one's setting it out. So it's supplementary to that point.
We are setting it out. The infrastructure funding statement does set it out. So just to be clear, it sets out what we've received in the year and what we've spent in the year. It does set it out. What I think we were being asked to do was, could we make that simpler so we can see when it came in and when it was spent? I think was the request, which I've said we can go away and look at. But the infrastructure funding statement is a national requirement in terms of it's as a document.
Councillor Pavlovic.
Yeah. I'm not going to go through all of the Cottonthorpe issues, most of which were decided prior to Councillor Stewart being the ward councillor. But these issues went through committee. They were in a report. They were discussed. They were, I believe, were voted on. And once they're set, and once they are a section 106, although it says it can be varied, a deed of variation, that has to be with the developer's consent. It also has to be something that is a viable option. Now, the officer that made those recommendations didn't do it because they wanted to stitch Cotmanthorpe up. They did it because a request had come in, it had been analysed, and it was felt appropriate by the planners to be incorporated into the planning. And what's complicated isn't the fact that it goes to a committee and all of the section 106s, of which there are many, and particularly on a large development, they are all written down. They are all incorporated into the report. They are all on the planning portal. If there are issues, they should be flagged up at that stage. And if you are the ward councillor and are particularly interested in making sure there's a development coming in my ward or that's close to my ward where there is potential for section 106, start having those conversations at that early stage. As soon as you see that planning application come in, that's the time, I think, to start engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably where this is going to end up, because I would say that once it is at committee stage or even published papers stage, it is too late. So even if a ward councillor turned up to the relevant committee, the application's either going through or it isn't with that 106 as is. You know, and I learned that quite brutally with York Central, you know, a huge 106 agreement that, dare I say, passed the ward councillors by. We weren't ever, the Riverside Path is being upgraded, which a lot of people are happy with. But in the York Central 106 agreement, if you look on the very last page, there's a really weird Riverside cycle path that no one has a clue who's drawn, why it's going in that direction. It's so strange. So yeah, you've got to get in really early. Councillor Stewart, I'm guessing it's a supplementary.
It is, yeah.
And then I've got Councillor Hook, who's been very patient, and Councillor Ben Burton and Stephen Fenton.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. So it's just, I think, a couple of important clarifications. So as Councillor Powell says, most of this was before my time, but the developer can seek to vary the section 106. So what happened on this case was I spoke to the planning officer and I clarified the process for varying the section 106. They're very helpful. I spoke to the developer and they said they would have no issues with varying the section 106 as we sought to, which was one simple thing about less money to Ascombe Bog and more money to Yorkfield Lane. No issue whatsoever. After that, though, when the developer presumably spoke to the City of York Council and said, we'd like to potentially vary this section 106, every single shutter went up at that point. The developer was told in no uncertain terms, this wouldn't be happening, okay? CYC wouldn't be revisiting this process, or the developer for some other reason decided to do a total about turn. And then everything was thrown out, you've had your chance. And by that, I mean, the section 106 went on the website, I think it was 2 days, 48 hours before the committee report. Now, the way that planning balance works, as we all know, you have to have enough reasons to reject an application. It's ultimately what's on the table, pass it or reject it, okay? You can't vary things meaningfully apart from conditions, okay? So there was no way a committee could say, in this section 106 agreement of dozens of pages, we'd like to vary that. But CYC, the parish council's been able to comment on it. The parish council had 48 hours to comment. Now, can they make any meaningful comments in that time? The parish council had the opportunity to speak at the committee. It did. It had 3 minutes to speak. It defies belief that we can say a planning committee could reject based on in section 106. They clearly couldn't. A parish council of volunteers could respond in a 48-hour window, and that a parish council can comment meaningfully in the whole application in 180 seconds and the section 106. You know, and that's just not right as a process for me.
I hear you, and yeah, I get where you're coming from, but if we can try and keep this to questions, if I may. Sorry, I should say as well, I omitted Councillor Healy from my list before, I got confused with a supplementary he raised. So I've got Councillor Healy, then Councillor Hook, then Ben Burton, then Councillor Fenton, and Councillor Vassy.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have two questions, but I'm more than prepared to only ask one and then drop down the list, if that would.
Very generous.
Yep.
See how we go.
I'll ask them slightly more complicated one first. Talking about variation, so this is referring to page 16, item 16, where you go into a scenario about amending things if the viability of the project worsens. An example I'd like to use is on the Hungate development, which has probably been going on for best part of 15 years now. 207, 208, they asked for variation due to the temporary dip in house prices that removed a lot of the community S106 payments. A year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, when they're still building it out, York had the second highest house price rises in the country. So they would have started their development saying 205, built one block, 5 years later, another block, etc., etc., etc. They took the opportunity for a temporary dip to essentially lose half of their S106 contributions, which we've never been able to get back after house prices massively increased. So the question is, when developers do ask for variations, do we give them variations on, okay, that's happened today, you're doing this section of your build, we will vary planning conditions on that section. It doesn't apply to the whole new development, of which is going to last another 10 years. And I believe Hungate is, well, it's definitely not even built out yet, and I would guess has no date for when it would be built out.
You're bringing, and you know, and I completely understand the frustrations. You're bringing up individual cases of Section 106s that you happen to disagree with, or cases that I can't answer. I genuinely cannot answer that. I can't answer that one. I can't answer that one. And I'm not sure that Becky would, had she been here. The question is about, if the question is, how do you vary an application without talking about a specific case that you've got a specific interest in, then the answer I would say is yes, a development of some significant scale, and you will have seen it through the local plan process, has build out times of 10 years plus. And that was a large site. And yes, when there are circumstances as a property price dip, which impacts on viability of that site, then that is a legitimate time for a developer to say, I need a variation, and that's why Becky refers to it, notwithstanding the fact she used a double negative, which I really don't like, in paragraph 15. Then, you know, there will be circumstances, and viability is one of them, in which a variation is an appropriate request for a developer to make. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think obviously Hungate is one of the bigger and more complex Section 106 agreements in there. But I think we've also learned, so if you look at the Coney Street one, that's got a more sophisticated review mechanism in it than the Hungate one does. So actually, I think we've started to learn from those issues that we see over long-term developments.
Okay. Thanks for the responses. I mean, I should say, if you don't mind me saying, Councillor Healy, I think the example you raised was in order to put that question over to illustrate the point. Yeah. Councillor Stewart, is it a supplementary? Okay, fire away.
But just on the learning related to some of these big developers, are we confident in all our S106s that they entirely cover us against the developer going bust? Obviously, parts of the S106 have build out rates based on house number this, but are we confident that any of them can't be exploited by either, you know, the developer happening to go bust or a more cynical developer putting in one thing? Because I know there have been issues in the past,
So section 106 is linked to the land, not the developer. So if someone else comes along and develops that land because the developer's gone bust, the new developer pays the section 106 agreement. So it's not tied to a company, it's tied to the land. So if someone else comes along and wants to build on it, they will do it. The triggers are normally that you receive the money in advance. So you'll reach a certain point, a trigger point of so many houses that the payment gets paid, and that's linked to mitigating the impact. So when does your impact start to hit? That's when the payment's made.
Yeah.
But if a developer goes bust, so I suppose that in the worst case scenario, your trigger point might be at 15 houses, 10 houses are built and then goes bust. You may miss out on that payment, but the chances are someone come along and build the rest out and the trigger point is still hit and paid.
No, I understand. I mean, one potential extreme would be developer builds everything and then goes bust. You know, so have we, for example, not got anywhere, there'd be that.
Most developments, their section 106 triggers are on commencement or on first occupation. So once you start selling the development, when you sell house one, then your 106 becomes payable. And it's to stop that, you know, so they can't sell all of the houses, then go into liquidation without having paid the 106. So there's you wouldn't have a 106, and you know, I stand to be corrected on this. You wouldn't have a 106 that's eligible at the end of a development. It's always when a certain trigger point is hit, and that is when it first happens, not when it last happens.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovich. I'll go to Councillor Hook, who's been very patient. Thank you.
It's not patience, it's whether I can remember what I wanted to ask. That's the problem. But, we started off talking about CILs, and then we went to, obviously this was about section 106 and reporting. One, are we thinking of going on to CILs? And two, I know that's going to be a lot more work, because one of the good things about CILs is it catches the developers who decide they're only going to put in 9 properties because they dodged the 10, and all the ones who put 1 there, 1 there, 2 there, 2 there, and have a big impact and get away scot-free. And I think that's why I think CIL's good. But how are you progressing on that?
Yes, we are progressing towards SIL, I think is the short answer.
Yeah. And we hope to have it implemented by the year end. So SIL was consulted on as part of the local plan hearings, has been consulted on, will be consulted on a second time, and you're absolutely right, and that is the benefit of SIL. It's not development specific. We can spend it anywhere on infrastructure, and secondly, it's done on square footage of one dwelling or more. So yes, it's going to be a real game changer for the city.
But no doubt keeping a record of it is going to be escalated umpteen fold.
It's another job. It's another job.
Yeah, I can design the spreadsheet.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovich. I've got 2 hands. Are these supplementaries? Yeah, Councillor Merritt and Councillor Stewart. Keep them brief if we can, because we still have a fair queue.
Yes. How are we, with section 106, you get monies to do things that are needed for the development that provide additional facilities in the local community. How are we going to ensure that that continues to happen with SIL if it's a general payment and not specifically tied to providing specific things for that local development and that local community. How do we ensure that we don't have an even worse version of what's happened with some of the section 106, where provision for sports or leisure ended up being provided large distances from the development, remote from the people who need them?
Well, I think that's partly the split about the hyperlocal bit, which we've covered earlier. But also what I would say about SIL is actually it's about the council identifying priorities. So actually the ability for members to set strategic intent is greater with SIL than it is with section 106.
Yeah. Councillor Stewart?
Yeah, apologies, I'm not queue jumping by tagging on lots of supplementaries. But on 49, obviously, which it talks about the basis of gross internal area times SIL rate. It is still a percentage. So my point is, are there lots of different factors that get the SIL rate where it's percentage and then it's based on square foot, or is it all the same? So will we have more of a SIL in a high value area, for example, or is it just the same?
It's done on the square footage. If I don't, what I will ask Alison, Alison Cook, to do is to send you the square footage calculation that went through. I mean, it will go to a further consultation, but things got took out to be nil rated, and other things got put in. So, for example, purpose-built student accommodation now has a SIL contribution to it, as well as now an affordable housing contribution. So, so these are. But what I'll do through you, Chair, is get those get the paper that went through the local plan. We could pull it up, but by the time you get it, it's the meeting's going to have finished, hopefully.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovic. Next, I've got Councillor Ben Burton.
Thanks. A couple of quick, I mean, the SIL being brought in will be great, because I mean, my experience was trying to beg, borrow and steal section 106 back on the Ashfield football pitches a while ago to try and make use of it. And it was a really frustrating situation where money was being given back just at the point we were identifying it. So hopefully the new system is better. I guess my takeaway from that is, one is that developers are actually quite flexible if we ask them to change where they were being asked to provide it. So if we are close to the position where we're having to return payments, which hopefully we won't anymore, but they are generally quite flexible. If you just go to them and say, want to use it here instead, I think we need to provide that flexibility. And the other one is writing more flexible. Some section 106s just say within a certain mileage. That is much better than tying them to a specific development. And I think if we can ask planners and solicitors to try and focus on giving broad, even if we know where we're going to use it, use the most broad definition that we can. But obviously SIL will vastly improve this. I was mainly thinking when we were talking before about learning lessons along the way with section 106 agreements, with more complicated ones, which we have to do more. With SIL, if we kind of allowed a bit of a budget for getting external support for the first few times we deal with it, basically, because it's going to be a whole new process for staff, solicitors, planners when it gets to that stage.
Yeah, part of SIL is it incorporates management and fee, so that we can make sure that it's administered properly. The issue that you raise, interestingly though, about being more generic as opposed to specific, has positives and negatives. We see numerous ones that, you know, this money could go to this park or this park or this park, which may be in 3 different wards. You then end up with a bun fight as to who's going to get it, where the need is greatest, and which isn't always that easy. Sometimes it's better to say it will go to this park because that is the park closest to the development. But again, that may not always work, because if you're in an area where there's quite a lot of development or quite a big development, you could have a disproportionate amount of money going to that one area. So it's a finely balanced thing, but that's where I think the discussions about what is our need as ward councillors in an area with parks and open spaces managers or with the directors or whatever might be really, really useful, you know.
Thank you. Another supplementary from Councillor Stewart.
Sorry, it's a point rather than a question, which is, I think you can do both, because in Cottonthorpe, we've got one S106, which talks about, you know, the facilities being provided sport-wise, whereas another, we've got a ranking that it should be preferred as one. So I think you can have that way to say, look, it's likely to be this one, but it may not be. And I think that does solve the problem.
James?
The legal agreements, they're not just ours. So they're a legal agreement with a developer. They will have a set of solicitors also reviewing that agreement that goes back and forth. So to say we have a standard approach would be lovely, but with Section 106, it's unlikely because you've got a range of developers. The advantage of SIL is it turns that on its head and makes it a standard approach for anything that's off-site. So Section 106 will still exist for stuff on-site, and SIL is the stuff off-site, which will be standardised. But as I say, it'd be wrong to say it's just us, because developers obviously have a legal team helping develop those Section 106 agreements.
Thank you. That's helpful. Next, I've got Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I think where we are now in terms of the process, in terms of the recording and tracking, is an improvement on where we've been. So I think I'm less concerned about the kind of process issues. I think just a question that I don't expect you to answer it now. The issues seem to be more in kind of communications, both the beginning and the end of the process, in terms of how can we influence the Section 106 formation. And so some officers might be a bit reluctant about being bombarded by, you know, you've got 3 councillors on board and one of them is on at you, or what do the other 2 think? You know, so we're potentially putting officers in a difficult position. So any way we can kind of say, right, this is your opportunity to feed in a slightly more structured way, other than, you know, individual members trying to track down the officer that we think might be involved in discussions. And then at the end of the process, you know, I'm as guilty as anyone of tracking down said officer to say, 8 years ago those houses were built and there was £12,000 for playground equipment. It's never been spent. You know, I don't want us to lose it, but I'm conscious that might be replicated 47 other times, the same one officer dealing with the same volume of queries. So I just, something to leave with you in terms of how that process can be managed so that we can get the information that, frankly, I think we're entitled to, but try to get it in a way that enables us to either challenge where necessary or let our residents know what's going on, but not in a way that you know, means that officer doesn't have the time to do the work that they need to be getting on with because they're dealing with all the questions from us.
Yeah, it's a really valid point. You know, could have, should have done more to engage, you know, and this is going back 10, 15, 20 years, you know, this isn't a new phenomenon. But we are trying, you know, now that we've got a system in place, now that we've got the opportunity to track and engage with better, you know, it's something that we really can, should, and will do. But you're right, and the problem is that you going to that one, either planning officer or parks officer, and saying, "Where's my money?" Is being replicated, and it's you know, we really do have very limited resources, and it is technical work, because you've got that. If it's a planning officer, and I've just done this piece of work on the back of this report that you know, and I've said, so tell me where all the parks and open spaces money's gone. And it's a spreadsheet, and it is, you know, these developments here, and these developments here, and this is what it's spent, this is what it's allocated to. And that's just available money. That's not even money that the triggers haven't been met on. And, you know, it did take the officer, and I felt justified in asking it because I thought this may come up. You know, it did take the officer hours to do that, and that was just on one little area. When you then take highways into account, and you take affordable housing into account, and you take education into account, and you take, you know, it is a big piece of work trying to break it down on a ward by ward basis, particularly when some of it will straddle more than one ward.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovic. So I've got a banging headache here. Councillor Vassie, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take a slightly different look at this. So just summing up some of the things that have been said, James Gilchrist said that members should be discussing these things before they come to planning, and that's perfectly reasonable. You then said, but we don't hear about things coming to planning until it's too late. Paul referenced varying Section 106 payments in the context of temporary housing dips, and that questions about whether the variations could be time limited. We then heard about the planning department learning from these large developments and changing its approach over time. It seems to me, I would argue, that there's a real need for training and best practice understanding in this area. And maybe the Planning Advisory Service could help us. I know we've had a previous meeting on the local plan with the Planning Advisory Service. I'm particularly aware of a number of occasions where I look at what's been agreed in the Section 106 agreement and think, well, why has that not been included? Why are we not looking at, for example, what they're doing in London boroughs and elsewhere to use Section 106 to get payments from developments if they fail to meet the carbon reduction targets on a development? And I think we've talked about maybe incorporating that into the special planning documents as a way of moving forwards. There are many examples like that. There was a development in my ward last year for 150 homes where there was nothing in it about using that development to contribute via Section 106 to the creation of a cycle path to link my village to York. Other local authorities do use Section 106 payments to do those kind of things, but the advice here was you can only talk about what happens within the development itself. And so time and time again, it seems that there's a kind of misunderstanding on all sorts of different levels. And then we tell ourselves, well, we're only very small. We've only got limited resources. We can't do this. Well, from my perspective, we have to find out how to sort that out. Because for our residents and for our city, we need to be using these mechanisms to the utmost advantage of York. And I'm talking about SIL as well as Section 106 agreements. So my proposal is, could we agree to have training and in best practice for all of us so that we're better informed and better able to respond earlier to things rather than continuously finding ourselves, well, that's a great idea, councillor, but I'm afraid we've already sorted it out. It's too late. That's not good enough. Can we find a different approach to this?
I mean, we can always make that recommendation. Do we have a response to that? We can come back to it.
Yeah, I think we do use Planning Advisory Service. We do use Planning Advisory Service for member training, as Councillor Vassie has talked about, and we do that on a fairly regular basis. I think we've done the batch not that long ago, actually, but we can certainly look at Section 106 and SIL as that comes in as a specific piece of training. And I think we've recently done some training about what having a local plan means, for instance. The point I was making about getting early wasn't necessarily about getting in early with the planning process, though. So the point I was making is the more a community, whether that's through a parish council, through the engagement we do, or the role of ward councillors, identifying what the priorities are for those things that regularly come up through section 106 and will through SIL to mitigate development around education, transport, play, sport and recreation, etc. Can be discussions that go on. And the more formed our asks are in advance, the stronger our cases will be as well.
Yeah, thank you, James. I've got Councillor Merritt as the last one. Sorry.
Very quickly respond because I welcome what's been said there.
Is it a question, Councillor Massey?
Well, it is a response to what's just been said. My community, and I'm sure we've all got examples in our own communities.
Yes.
My community has campaigned for 20 years for a cycle path from Elvington and Weldrake into the city. The planners know that. It's been in the papers. But when the big planning development comes forward, nothing's there. So I just think we've got to coordinate this better.
Well, I entirely agree, but I would say that's probably where this conversation's hopefully taken us anyway. And we will get to recommendations very shortly. Councillor Pavlovic.
Yeah, we've got 3 hours training delivered by PAS on the 5th of June from 1 o'clock. So hopefully you'll be there. Yes. So, well, you've made my point for me that we do put training on regularly, including on section 106. And, you know, we have done training, and there's at least, I think in this last 12 months, we've had 3 lots of member training on this. But as for issues like cycle paths, the point is, from one point to another point, to be able to evidence, and as James has said, the developers have their own really smart lawyers to say, we want 106, we can't evidence that it's to mitigate this development because it's a wider use, is something that potentially the developers will push back on. That's where the beauty of SIL comes in. That's where things like your cycle paths, that's where your infrastructure, that's where your active travel stuff, that's where we can really start to ramp up what we can deliver. And this will be millions and millions of pounds that are coming in. I think the estimate is, what is it, James? I can't remember. It's several million a year.
Yeah,
Let's put it that way.
We just have to make sure we stop consultants from working out how to spend it all for us, you know, on never-ending design stages. But yeah, no, it absolutely will be a positive change. I've got Councillor Dave Merritt, and then I will move to recommendations because we'll have been on this for over an hour by then.
I just wanted to ask a question about the sections 39 to, sorry, paras 39 onwards, where you were talking about the problems with the section 106s as opposed to the SIL in terms of the resources to do the actual delivery side of it. And there's comments in there which basically sort of say we can't do it. But then it sort of also says, well, we're able to do it in some circumstances. I was just wanting to get some clarity on that. Is that an issue with the legislation around section 106s, or is it an issue with the NPPF, what the NPPF says on that, or is it an issue with what we've actually said in our local plan and the local plan policies, or sorry, there was another potential one I saw when I was thinking about it. Yeah. Or is it just because of the particular 106 that limits our ability to do it? So I was just trying to understand what the nature of the problem is with getting the extra to actually make the section 106 happen.
So the challenge is around scale and focusing on delivery. So this is outside the planning process now. So planning will pass the funding to.
Yeah, no, this was about gaining funding out of the section 106 to pay for the staff to deliver.
Yeah, so yes, so historically, the guidance nationally has been you shouldn't use section 106 to pay for staffing. That is up for review, I think. So we've actually asked for some review of that, which is reflected, I think, in this paper. Some of those, though, they are very small projects. So, you know, £8,000 for a play area, you're not going to get an officer out of that. But actually, if we amassed them and thought about it in a bigger way, could we? And I think it's partly part of the way we're thinking about it is how can we look at section 106 and our other delivery programs so that rather than it becoming all the pressures in one team, actually, can we think about project delivery in the broader sense and actually look at project delivery and not worry about whether it's section 106 or it's council capital or it's this, but how do we actually accelerate delivery across the piece? But we are seeking some advice. So it's probably, I think the best way to deal with that is that we probably need a written response back as we're waiting for that advice imminently.
Councillor Pavlovic?
Yeah. All the issues that have been raised tonight are issues that are really legitimate and of real concern to me, and I've recognised that the 106 system hasn't really worked as well as any of us would have liked to have seen it work. And all right, I may have come back across as being slightly defensive, and I really didn't mean to, because your anxieties are my anxieties, and where we're getting to now is like a million miles from where we started off, if that makes sense.
It does, yes.
You know, if it's opaque now, you should have seen it 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And so I am genuinely trying, and that's why I really do value all of your input, because particularly about how do we better engage with our ward councillors in what your priorities are. And I know you're coming on to recommendations, so I'm not prompting you. But you know, I genuinely do feel that there needs to be a mechanism developed, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. And so, you know, I'm really interested in any thoughts on how it might work. As to say, you know, what are the 5 big things that we would like to see in our ward? It might be as simple as that. It might be more complicated. I genuinely don't know. But whatever it is, I think we all want to hear, and the planners as well, and the officers in education and in transport and in affordable housing also want to know what are your priorities, because it's an art as much as it's a science.
Absolutely, and I just to say, I would agree that there's definitely a clear improvement on where we were several years ago. If we were opaque then, we're probably approaching translucent now. Still the way approaching translucent. Yes, Councillor Hook, is it? Yeah.
Thinking it's not necessarily our priorities now, but we have to think when we've got this extra population, what's needed as well, because that's the whole point of it, isn't it? It's to compensate for that extra population and extra cars and extra everything.
Yeah.
So we've got to do a bit of time travel as well.
And that's on all of us, I reckon, when we're having such discussions, if we get to that place. So, which brings me to recommendations. We've covered a lot of ground here, which is always good. I take the point, Councillor Pavlovic, that training is regularly rolled out to members, but I hope Councillor Vassy, well, correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, Councillor Vassy, but I think there probably is a bit of room for not just training on how 106 works, but how members can basically make the most of it. And if there are good examples of that elsewhere in the country, because there probably are places doing it better than us. There's no shame in admitting that, is there? And then I think that would be helpful to members, rather than anything sort of generic, as it were. I think, and I don't disregard the difficulties because it sounds like a nightmare job, but a necessary one. This point around the infrastructure funding statement and trying to find a way of allowing that to show a longer view, including trigger points and whatnot. Now, that sounds like a project in itself, but I think there seems to be a consensus that that document could be improved both to aid members and the general public. So I'd want a recommendation to give that a look, really, about how it can be done. Obviously money, time, all the other pressures and restrictions are in the mix. This point, I see you, Councillor Stewart, I'll come to you in a second. This point around sort of members, if you like, direct engagement in what 106 may or may not provide for their areas. I think it's clear that the engagement doesn't come with planning. It has to come with the officers who planning consult with on 106. And I think there's a recommendation to consider what mechanisms might work best to achieve that, given the time constraints that officers and we as members are under, because, you know, there's 47 of us. It might be as simple as having a good quality live document that gets updated for each ward as and when it needs to be updated and which ward members can feed into. It could just be a once a year meeting for the relevant officers, because I couldn't tell you who the relevant officers were. I've got an idea of 1 or 2, maybe 3, but it'd be good to sort of have a clear idea of who the people are that we need to effectively lobby, I suppose, before they end up having those 106 conversations. But exactly how that works, it has to be better than ad hoc emails and loose meetings. There's got to be a good way of doing that. You've mentioned you'll send over the SIL paper that was through a local plan working group. And Councillor Stewart, you had a hand.
Thanks, Chair. It's quite a specific one, so hopefully it can be a recommendation rather than me having raised it in debate. At Planning Committee, we obviously have amounts of S106s that will go to education, NHS, and all these things for housing developments. And they're quite set figures, you know, education is based on bedrooms and that sort of thing. Councillor Moroney has twice asked the question, why is there nothing for the NHS in this application? And it's basically being because the NHS hasn't responded. So you might have 80 houses there where the NHS is going to get 700,000, 87 houses there it's going to get nothing. And it's just ridiculous that the NHS or any other consultee hasn't responded. You know, in very simple terms, we're looking at a transfer of money from a developer to the NHS or some other entity. And it's basically that we've consulted them and they haven't replied. Now, it was mentioned at planning yesterday when Councillor Moroney raised it. I think it's minuted that it will be looked at by scrutiny. So not wanting to preempt that, but equally not wanting that to go on some very long-winded tour, my suggestion would be a particular recommendation that for these consultees, if they don't respond, we follow it up. And that might be nothing more than a forwarded email, literally, dear NHS, you didn't respond. Is that the case? Followed by, you know, a phone call. Is Barry Bloggs the right person? So next to no time, we're talking about hundreds of thousands being allocated to a development, i.e. our residents, or not being.
Thanks, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Pavlovic, were you mouthing to me that we do that?
Yeah, we constantly, if there is a statutory consultee, such as the NHS, but there are others, and they haven't responded, we do chase it up. However, there is essentially a cut-off, and the government have actually acknowledged that the lack of response from statutory consultees is holding up the planning process, and are saying, you know, if you don't get a response, have to go ahead as though there was a response. But yes, so there is constant follow-up, but sometimes you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But SIL will be where you will then be able to say, well, our overall health strategy infrastructure is going to be this, and this. And that may be one opportunity that you'll then get to say, you know, this is where we need a new health centre, or this is where we need a new annex to an existing health centre, to mitigate the impact of one or more developments.
Very quickly, councillor Stewart.
Yeah, I do hear that, but when it's been asked by councillor Maroney, and the planning officers have said they have been consulted, we've not had a reply back. Whereas if they were followed up like we would expect, I would expect the planning officer sat there to say, yeah, we definitely consulted them, didn't hear anything back, then we chased them again, and then we had nothing back. Or I found it quite frustrating dealing with this entity because we spoke to them several times, no response. We haven't had that. We've basically at committee been told, well, yeah, we did contact them. We didn't get anything. And I don't think that level of chasing is reasonable given the money in play.
I am assured we do follow it up every time. We have done a bit of cross-departmental working and planning. Have talked to Peter Roderick, the Director of Public Health here at the council, who has put us in contact with a new person at the NHS. So we think we've made some progress in trying to unblock some of that. So not only do we chase, we're now escalating as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Healy, did you?
Yes, thank you, Chair. As a recommendation, in addition to the one that tries to pull together like a multi-year view of money's in, money's out by planning application, I did ask Becky if she could send us on confidential papers all of the monies that have rolled over the 5 years and had to be given back, and also rolled over the 5 years and we still have, because I can't see what we can ever do with that money. And I think that was one of the instigators of this whole meeting, is that the monies just weren't being spent or returned. She was trying to get that for today, but obviously that hasn't happened. So if we could ask for that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like she's aware and on the case, but we can certainly.
Yeah, if you could put it in the recommendations. I would suggest though it is on pink paper.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to wrap that up there because the recommendations are quite meaty and will take a bit of work. Grateful for colleagues. Councillor Mayor, is that a hand? Sorry.
It is, Chair. I think the recommendations are very good. My only thought is just on the issue of how we get the member involvement, whether that's something a task and finish group. You know, we've obviously covered a lot of ground today in general principles, but I don't think that was one that was resolved by the discussion, other than we need to do something.
Yeah.
I do wonder if a task and finish group with the exec member and officers, in terms of seeing if we can work out a practical arrangement for that. And that could also include picking up how we deal with the SIL when it comes in terms of the non-parish areas as well. You know, so I think there's two issues that could be sensibly dealt with by a task and finish.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the way we're meant to be working.
Yes,
in terms of the new scrutiny
indeed.
arrangements.
I think that's a really good shout, Councillor Merritt, and that's certainly a task and finish group I'd be happy to give my time to. So yeah, I'll happily include that. You can hold me to that as well. If we're short on willing members.
Only holding for a very short time now.
Yeah. But I will close the item there. Councillor Pavlovic, thank you for your contributions. Always good to get stuck in with you. James, I think this might be your last time at this committee. Want to wish you. I hope this committee hasn't aged you unduly. But you know, always appreciate how much you give to this committee and to the council as a whole. I know that you know, you probably have various interactions with us all as members, but I think your service is absolutely respected, and I genuinely wish you all the best for what comes next for you. I hope you serve wherever you go just as well as you have here, if not better. We'll miss you. I'll miss you anyway.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Colleagues, the next item is work plan, but the committee is sort of evolving. So I'm minded, I mean, we have the list of items that are yet to be allocated. The new chair, whoever that may be, I'm assuming it will be a certain someone. They should be aware of what the committee wants to deal with. And the items that are on there will hopefully be allocated. We've had some slippage with a couple of items, including the asset of community value one, which is having to wait some months, I believe. But there's lots on there to get penciled in. And I trust the new committee will get them dealt with. I'll be on this committee too, so I'll be batting to make sure that they are dealt with within the time that we do have, along with all the many task groups that will also take place alongside committees. So I'll wrap this up there, and I'd like to thank you all for your contributions as members while I've been chair. I've thoroughly enjoyed chairing this committee, and for the most part, we've avoided party political nonsense. But when we have indulged in it, I think it's been healthy and good spirited. So yeah, thanks from me, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Cheers.